Asterisk, of course. Then let us return to the year 1811, to the city of Salem, Massachusetts, where the fog still clung to the cobblestones, like memory itself, and where the past was not a chapter, but a presence, a weight, a voice that whispered through keyholes, and drifted from behind church doors. For in that year a woman arrived whose footsteps would echo through the generations. Victoria Fairfax, widow of a plantation doctor, born of old Virginia, blood with eyes like slate, and a voice that softened when she lied. She stepped from the carriage not as a guest or a teacher, but as a builder of something sacred. Or so they were told. She wore black not for mourning, but for control, and when she smiled, it never reached her eyes. Her mouth spoke of redemption for the forgotten girls of New England, but her hands were always cold, even in summer, and her gaze lingered too long on the youngest and weakest of them. She purchased the Hartwell mansion, a house that no one wanted, a house whose silence had teeth. Built in 1787 by a trader who made his fortune in opium and flesh, and who died alone, screaming into the walls, the house stood empty for years, its windows watching the harbor like unblinking eyes. No family could last more than a season inside. Its halls, whispers at night, scratches in the walls, mirrors that refused to reflect, and yet Victoria walked its corridors with reverence and possession. She smiled at the creaks, she caressed the banisters, she called it chosen. Within months the renovations began. Men labored without knowing why. They grew sick, their dreams disturbed. One fell from the roof and was buried in the garden. With no priest and no marker, 3 fled in the night and were never seen again. But still the chapel was built, its windows stained with saints and suffering, its altar imported from Spain, said to have once belonged to a convent that burned with all its nuns locked inside. Behind the chapel came dormitories, 30 beds, iron frames, no curtains, cold as punishment, and then the 3rd floor was divided into private chambers, where light barely entered, where no blueprints remained, where no servant dared linger. She was not alone in her holy endeavor. Her younger sister Evangeline moved through the halls like a shadow, soft and trembling, her voice beautiful enough to make a soldier weep, and yet she never made eye contact, never left the property, and never spoke above a whisper. She taught music and French, and sometimes prayer, but never smiled when the girls cried, and never stopped singing even when someone screamed upstairs. And then there was Bartholomew, Victoria's brother-in-law, tall like a warning, thin like starvation. His sermons were fire, and his hands were always hidden behind his back. He spoke of sin as if it lived in the bones of women, and warned that obedience was the only path to heaven. He smelled like smoke, even when nothing burned, and he knew every girl's name before they arrived. The academy opened with a parade of piety and perfume. The mayor came, the bishop came. The newspaper wrote of moral salvation and spiritual cultivation. The first class included 23 girls. Some paid, some poor, all dressed the same, all watched the same, all fed the same prayers and porridge. In the beginning there was laughter, there were games, there were lessons, but by the first frost of that year the laughter had died, and the girls had learned to stop asking questions. Among them was Margaret Sullivan, red-haired, quick-tongued, an orphan taken from the mills, where her hands bled daily for pennies. She had believed in the promise. She had read the scripture. She had seen Victoria's eyes, and believed they meant salvation. Now she scrubbed the floors with lye, and sang hymns until her throat bled, and did not ask why she bled between her thighs every week. Priscilla Morse, too, had once believed. She had loved books, had dreamed of becoming a teacher, but the books here were only sermons, and the only lesson she was given was how to endure silence. Hannah Whitmore was the youngest, small, pale, her mother gone, her father imprisoned. She smiled even after the first beating, even after the first night locked in the chapel. Alone, but she stopped smiling the night the men came. They never came in daylight. They never knocked, their carriages black, their faces hidden. They entered through the side door, the one that led to the 3rd floor, their boots silent, their breath shallow. The girls who were summoned never spoke of What happened not even to each other, but they limped, they winced, they stopped singing. Mrs. Thornton, the seamstress, saw them arrive, saw them leave. She saw blood on the snow once, and told no one she saw Victoria in her mourning dress, and felt nothing but dread. Then came December 13th, 1812. The night the chapel windows glowed like they were alive, the night Hannah screamed, and no one came. The night Mrs. Thornton heard something that changed her voice forever by dawn. Hannah was dead. Fever, they said, sudden. They said the funeral held behind locked doors, the hymns sung without conviction, and the coffin too small for someone who had just turned 13. The cemetery behind the academy grew 2 more crosses in February. Priscilla gone in her sleep. Mary O'Brien convulsed until her eyes turned inward. All natural, said Dr. Fairfax, cousin to Victoria, and keeper of death itself. The town believed him. Because they wanted to believe him, because they saw Victoria feeding the poor, and thought goodness smelled like lavender. But Margaret knew. She watched. She listened. She learned the pattern girls summoned after supper, returning hollow, the visits of the men always followed by fainting. Nausea, tremors. Margaret learned to fake piety, to smile while bleeding. She learned that obedience meant survival and silence meant longevity. She learned that truth was a weapon and that she had none. The journals began in secret scraps hidden under floorboards, pages sewn into dresses. She wrote because she had to, not to escape, but to survive. She wrote of locked rooms where girls knelt for hours until their knees split. She wrote of bathtubs filled with ice and girls held under until they confessed to sins they did not understand. She wrote of Bartholomew whispering Latin while holding a crucifix and bleeding from his palms. She wrote of Evangeline drugging the tea and Victoria reading aloud from books that were not scripture books, bound in skin, written in symbols that pulsed when stared at too long. She wrote that the chapel had a basement not listed on any map, that beneath the altar was a stairway carved into stone, that what lay beneath was not storage, but ceremony, that the screams were not always of pain, but of transformation. She wrote that some girls who went down never returned, and that the ones who did no longer remembered their names. By 1814, the academy was still praised by papers. The girls still smiled for visitors, but 12 of them were gone. Vanished. Explanations provided. Bodies not seen. Mrs. Thornton asked once, only once, and Victoria smiled so wide her teeth showed and said salvation requires sacrifice. Margaret survived 3 years. She became invisible. She walked through fire and did not burn. She was the last to see the ledgers, the names of men who paid not for education, but for access, for silence, for the right to reshape souls. She saw initials next to the word resolution and knew what they meant. She saw a page with her own name and a date. She had not yet lived to reach, and she ran. No one knows how she escaped. Some say she faked death. Others say a sympathetic servant hit her. Some say she was never real, only a spirit of vengeance. But one journal bore her signature, and it was found in 1848 in a lead-lined box under the chapel floor with 46 others, each telling a piece of a story that could not be buried, though they tried, though they sealed the records and burned the remains, though they erased the girls and renamed the land. Some stories do not die. They wait, they rot and ferment, and when unearthed, they do not scream. They whisper, and those who hear them are never the same. Again, because now you know, and you cannot unknow it. Now you understand why the air shifts in certain churches, why some hymns chill your spine, why some names ring hollow, no matter how many buildings bear them. Because power does not protect, it consumes. Because innocence is currency. Because the face of evil wears perfume and lace and speaks in the voice of a mother offering shelter. And because the chapel may be gone, and the house ash and the record sealed, but the hunger that built street, Mary's Academy was never buried. It was merely renamed, and it is still feeding, still waiting, still building its sanctuary behind curtains and classrooms and songs. And when you see her next, the woman in black, the one who smiles but never blinks, Remember this? There were 40. 7 journals, but only 23 graves, and silence was never consent. It was survival. It was the only thing they had left, and now it is yours too. Do you feel the weight of the change, knowing good? Then we may continue, for what lies ahead is darker still. It is said that evil needs only silence to grow. But what happened after the deaths of Hannah, Priscilla, and Mary was not silence. It was something colder, more deliberate, like a door, closed softly and locked from the inside. As winter gave way to spring in 1813, the Academy took on a new kind of stillness. Not the stillness of mourning, but the stillness of satisfaction, like a hunger temporarily. Fed Victoria Fairfax walked the halls with greater calm. Her footsteps measured her posture almost regal. Her sermons grew more intense, more intimate. She no longer spoke to the girls as students, but as souls waiting to be unburdened. She called them vessels. She told them their suffering was necessary, that their bodies were stained by the lives they had lived before coming here, and that only through complete obedience could they be made worthy of salvation. The chapel became the center of everything. Services were held daily, sometimes twice. The music grew more haunting, more minor, and slow Evangeline played. The organ with hands that no longer trembled, her voice more beautiful than ever, but void of feeling. Her eyes fixed always on the floor, and the girls sang too, but without emotion. Their mouths moved, their voices echoed, but the meaning of the words had been stripped away. They no longer understood what they were praising, or why. They only knew they had to sing, and that if they did not, they would be summoned to the 3rd floor. The meditation rooms had once been quiet spaces for prayer. Now they were punishment cells. The doors thick, the windows shuttered, the light thin and flickering. The girls placed there for disobedience were given no food, no blankets, only water-laced with something bitter, and a mirror that never reflected properly. Margaret had seen the inside once, after she had refused to recite the forgiveness passage. The room was so cold her teeth chattered, and the walls seemed to move slightly, as if breathing. She had scratched her own arms just to feel something, and when she emerged 3 days later, she could no longer remember the names of her parents. But that was not the darkest part. No, the darkness lived deeper. It lived in the names, the patterns, the rituals that had begun to shift subtly, almost imperceptibly. By April, Margaret noticed that the men who visited the Academy now did not come alone. They brought with them boxes covered in black cloth, sometimes heavy, sometimes making sounds. Like shifting glass, Victoria greeted them at the side entrance with a smile and a bow, the way a priest might greet relics, and the boxes were carried to the chapel, not the 3rd floor, and whatever was inside remained there. For days locked behind the altar door, no one dared ask what they contained. Until one night when Margaret woke to a sound she had never heard before, not a scream, not a hymn, but something lower, a kind of humming or chanting that came from beneath the floor she left. Her bed crept barefoot down the hallway past the dormitory door, past the paintings of saints with faces scratched off, past the stairwell that led down into the chapel. The door was open, just a crack, and inside she saw something she would never speak aloud, only write. The girls had been arranged in a circle, not all conscious, not all clothed. Candles were placed at precise intervals, each one burning blue, not yellow blue, like gas or ice. Bartholomew stood in the center, his hands raised, his eyes closed, muttering. In a language that sounded like broken glass, Victoria was on her knees before the altar head, bowed. The black box opened beside her, filled with something that pulsed like muscle. And the men, the ones from the carriages, stood in the shadows watching, some with hands clasped in prayer, others not praying at all. And when one girl cried out and collapsed, Victoria did not move Bartholomew, did not pause Evangeline, did not stop singing. In fact, she grew louder. Margaret ran, but she did not scream. She had learned not to scream because no one ever came, because screaming made you visible, and visible meant vulnerable. The next morning she pretended to be ill. Victoria placed a hand on her forehead, smiled. and said, "The spirit is testing you, child, be grateful." And Margaret nodded and forced herself to vomit just to make it believable. After that night, she no longer slept, she watched. She waited, she began to write. Again, more furiously hiding pages under the loose stone in the fireplace. She knew she would not survive the year unless she found a way out, and she knew no one would ever believe her unless they found the truth in her handwriting, not in her voice, not in her body. Those were no longer hers. And then one day in late May, another student vanished, not one of the orphans, but the daughter of a merchant from Boston, a paying student, the only child of a prominent family. Her name was Elizabeth Howe, and she had shown signs of resistance for weeks, refusing to eat, refusing to kneel, refusing to sing. And then she was gone. Victoria said she had been withdrawn by her parents. But no carriage had come, no letter had arrived, and her trunk remained in the dormitory untouched. And that night the chapel glowed again, and the blue light returned, and Evangeline sang something, not from the hymnal, something that had no words, only sound. And Margaret wrote that night that Elizabeth had not been taken away, she had been given, that she had been the offering, and that Victoria had said as much in her closing prayer, something about balance and blood and the restoration of harmony. And then came the fever, the one that swept through the academy in June, taking 7 girls in 12 days, and no doctor from town was called, and no funeral was held, only quiet burials in the back behind the sycamore tree, where the ground had always been soft. And Victoria declared it a trial from God, and spoke of renewal and resurrection, and made the surviving girls fast for 3 days. But Margaret saw what the others did not. She saw the soil around the graves turn black. She saw the sycamore tree begin to rot from the inside, its bark weeping a dark syrup that stained the stones. And she saw Victoria remove something from the altar room, a long object wrapped in linen, stained red, and she carried it not to the cemetery, but to the 3rd floor, and locked it behind a door no one had ever seen opened. Mrs. Thornton stopped delivering after that. She claimed illness. She moved away by the end of summer, and her cottage was purchased by an unknown man who never spoke, and who once burned every bush in the yard, and when asked why, he said they were listening. And the girls who remained learned to walk without sound and speak, without thought, and pray without meaning, because meaning was dangerous. Meaning drew attention. Meaning made you real, and to be real at St. Mary's was to be hunted. And somewhere in the walls something moved, something that was not rat or wind, something that breathed in time with the organ and sighed, when the girls slept and waited and remembered and learned their names. And Margaret wrote all of it not to escape, but to outlive, to infect the future, to ensure that when the building fell and the journals were found, the truth would not die in silence. But she did not write the worst part, the part she only hinted. At the part she could not name, the part about the door beneath the altar, the one sealed with lead and wax, the one Victoria called the mouth of mercy, and the reason the chapel was built on that exact spot, because it was not a choice, it was a requirement, a location, a key. And behind that door was not God, not mercy, not judgment, but something older, something hungry, something that needed what the world would not miss and paid well to feed. And that door was never opened in daylight, and never by hands that trembled. And what came through it sometimes wore the faces of girls who had died, and sometimes the voices of men who still lived, and sometimes it was just sound, just heat, just air that tasted like copper and ruin. And when the academy finally closed in 1847, not because of scandal, but because something went wrong, something beneath the floor cracked and bled, and whispered the governor himself, arrived with 2 carriages and no words, and the building was locked abandoned until demolition came a year later. And they found the box and the journals and the ledgers, but they never found the door, not because it was gone, but because it moved, because it was never a place, but a wound, and wounds heal, but never forget. And now you know why the ground still feels wrong there, why flowers wilt faster and animals do not linger, and why the archives remain sealed, because what Street Mary's awakened did not die. It adapted, it learned, and it waits still, and it remembers still, and it wants still. And those journals were not a warning. They were an invitation, and the story you are hearing is not the end, but the first whisper of its return. Then let us go deeper now into the part no one ever tells, because even the survivors would rather not remember, because even the documents hidden in sealed vaults never speak of what lay beneath the archives, beneath the stone, beneath the name Street Mary's, because names change, but purpose does not, and what they called salvation was a system. What they called obedience was design, and what they called virtue was a mask so perfect it bled white light and fooled even God for a time. By late summer of 1813, the air around the academy had shifted, not just among the girls, but in the soil, in the walls, in the light itself. Mornings no longer felt like beginnings. They felt like repetitions, as if the sun only rose to rehearse another day of forgetting, as if nothing was truly new. And even the youngest girls sensed this, though they had no words for it. Their hands moved more slowly in needlework. Their prayers became murmurs. Their thoughts folded inward and stayed there, locked behind stitched lips and empty stares. Margaret, by then, had become something between student and ghost. She was no longer summoned for third floor instruction, because Victoria said she was already sanctified, already hollowed out enough to serve a different role. And so she watched and wrote and waited. She noticed that the journals she hid now stained the pages with moisture that came from nowhere, that words she had never written appeared. Between the lines curling like smoke, she began to dream of girls who had never existed, and yet whom she remembered by name, and she no longer questioned why. On the equinox, Victoria held a sermon in the chapel that lasted 7 hours, no food, no breaks. The doors bolted from the outside, the girls forced to kneel until blood pooled beneath their skirts. She spoke of thresholds and cycles and keys, and repeated the phrase divine inversion until the words lost shape. Bartholomew stood silent beside her eyes, closed head, bowed arms outstretched, and behind them Evangeline played a single note over and over and over, until one girl collapsed and was dragged out and never seen again. Afterward, Margaret found something in her bed, a small strip of cloth, stitched with unfamiliar runes and damp with something that smelled like ash. It pulsed slightly when touched. She buried it behind the chapel, and when she returned to her room, the crucifix above her bed was missing, and in its place hung a small mirror that did not reflect her face, only her back. It was then that she began to hear them, the ones beneath the academy, the ones that the door had once held back, not voices, exactly not language, more like pressure against the ears, more like memory that did not belong to her. They whispered in the pipes in the drain, in the silence. Between hymns they said things like return and remember and bleed. And she understood that the chapel was not built to glorify God, but to conceal God's failure, to hold back what came before him. And she was not alone. Others began to change too. Annabel, who once sang so sweetly, now sat in corners biting her fingers until they bled. Lucinda, who could recite the gospel backward, now screamed whenever the bells rang, and young Clara, who had never spoken, began to recite entire pages from books that were never kept in the library, books that burned when touched and left no ash, only smell. Margaret documented everything, but the paper began to fight her. The ink moved, the letters rearranged, and sometimes her handwriting changed mid-sentence to something that did not follow the curve of her fingers, and she knew then that it was no longer a record. It was becoming a conduit, a tool, and that someone or something was reading her even as she wrote. Then came the fire, not in the dormitory, not in the kitchen, but beneath the altar. It burned without smoke, without flame, only heat and light, so bright that the windows cracked and the floor moaned. The fire consumed nothing, but still everything. Changed afterward, the walls pulsed slightly, the chapel smelled of salt and teeth, and Victoria began wearing gloves at all times, even in sleep, even in prayer, and when Bartholomew spoke his voice, sounded like it came from behind a wall of stone. After the fire, 2 more girls disappeared, and no announcement was made. The academy simply rearranged the seating, and no one asked, why not even the parents of the paying students? Because by then letters had stopped being answered, and the carriages that once came weekly now arrived only under moonless skies. And beneath all of it was the basement, the true chapel, not the one with stained glass, but the one with bone walls and iron floors, the one that no blueprint ever mentioned, the one Margaret discovered by accident or perhaps invitation she had followed. Victoria one night down the central staircase, past the bell pull and into a hidden corridor behind the altar door, and what she found beneath that house was not sanctuary, not penance, but worship of another kind altogether. The walls were lined with jars, each one containing something unnameable, a tooth floating in black oil, an eye that blinked when watched a length of hair, braided into a symbol that pulsed like breath, and on the far wall, carved deep into stone, was a map not of the world, but of something older, a spiral of symbols that seemed to move even in stillness, and Victoria stood before it with her hands outstretched, whispering in a language that no human mouth was meant to speak. Margaret did not scream, she did not run, she only memorized, she etched it into her memory, not to understand, but to survive. And when Victoria turned around and saw her standing there, she only smiled and said the vessel is ready. And from that moment, Margaret knew she would not die, not yet, because death was not the worst thing Street Marys could offer. Death was not final, it was merely a door, and the academy did not close doors, it opened them. Over the next weeks, Victoria changed more visibly. Her eyes turned darker, not in color, but in depth, as if she were sinking into herself. Her shadow no longer matched her movements, and her voice could silence a room without volume. The other girls avoided her gaze not from fear, but from instinct, and Evangeline began to weep during songs, her tears black and staining the keys. Margaret continued to write, but her pages now bled slightly at the corners, and she began to lose time, sometimes waking in places she did not remember entering, sometimes with dirt beneath her fingernails, and once with a name carved into her arm. That faded by morning, and when she asked Victoria about it, she said only it is how the door marks its own. And the men who came now no longer spoke at all, their eyes vacant, their hands gloved, their presence accompanied by a scent of rot and salt. And when they left, something was always missing: a girl, a book, a vial from the chapel shelf, and no record was kept, only memory, only pain. Margaret's last entry before the journal stopped was not in words, but in symbols, the same ones on the wall beneath the chapel, and when the demolition crew found it, they could not read it. But those who touched the page could not sleep for 3 days, and one went blind in a single eye and said it had shown him a place where the sun was eaten whole. And so the records were sealed, and the bodies buried, and the story forgotten, not because it was unbelievable, but because it was too real, because it explained too much, because every town has a building like that, a teacher like that, a chapel like that. And now that you know what it was, what it is, what it still could be, you must ask yourself, what did they feed beneath that chapel, and what still hungers now in the basement of your own memory? Because stories do not end, they sink, they wait, and the 3rd floor chamber is never empty, it is only closed for now. Then let the next veil fall, and may whatever still watches from behind the walls forgive what we are about to remember, because what came after was not a continuation. It was a reawakening, a slow curling of something ancient and unclean, something that had worn the academy like skin, and now wanted more. By the beginning of 1814 Street, Mary's was no longer a school in any sense, understood by God or man. It had become something else entirely, a vessel, a gate, a system of blood and silence, designed not to teach, but to shape, to sculpt, to strip away the self, until only obedience remained, and in that void something else could be poured in, something that did not belong in flesh. Margaret was not alone in noticing the shift, but she was the only one who dared record it. The others had begun to forget their pasts, to forget their names, to forget they were ever children once they moved through the halls like sleepwalkers there. Limbs obedient, their eyes empty, they obeyed before being asked. They cried without sound, they prayed in patterns. They did not understand, and when one of them vanished, the space she left behind collapsed like breath held too long, and no one spoke. Her name again, because names gave shape, and shape gave power, and Victoria would not allow anything that still had shape. The chapel bells began to ring at unusual hours, sometimes at 3 in the morning, sometimes during meals, and each time they did, the girls would rise from their beds or their benches and walk without question to the pews where Victoria would be, waiting, already cloaked in black, her voice like ice shattering. She would speak in tongues that sounded like thunder underwater, and her words would crawl into the girls' ears and stay there, pulsing, humming, infecting, and afterward they would not remember what she had said, but they would obey. More quickly, they would eat more slowly, they would bleed from the nose without pain. The garden began to die, nothing grew, not even weeds. The soil turned sour, and the birds stopped nesting in the trees around. The academy, the old sycamore at the back of the chapel, split open one night with a sound like bones snapping, and inside the hollow they found not rot, but rope and feathers, and something else, something that glowed faintly before turning to ash. The third floor no longer needed to be locked. The girls feared it too deeply to approach it on their own. They said it breathed, they said it whispered. They said when you walked past its door, you lost your reflection for an hour, and when you looked in the mirror again, your eyes were older or colder, or filled with something that wanted out. Bartholomew changed next. His sermons no longer mentioned God. They spoke only of purity and offering and the need to empty the vessel before the great fulfillment. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He stood for hours before the altar humming a single tone, and when he walked his shadow moved the wrong way once he placed his hand on Margaret's forehead, and for days afterward she could not feel heat or cold or touch her skin numb as glass. And Evangeline began to unravel. She sang, even when alone she laughed, when no one spoke to her, and sometimes she screamed into her hands as if silencing someone inside her. Once Margaret found her in the hallway, kneeling before a cracked painting of St. Lucia and whispering over and over, "It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to be like this." And when Margaret asked what she meant, Evangeline only said, "You'll understand when it's your turn." And then the chapel changed, no longer confined to wood and stone. Its borders became suggestions. The walls bled warmth. The stained glass wept clear fluid, and the floor pulsed beneath their feet. And when they knelt, it felt as if they were resting on breath, and beneath the breath, something vast and watching waited for its name to be spoken, waited for its mask to fall, waited for the final girl to be hollowed out enough to become its voice. And Margaret was that girl. She knew it, she felt it, she fought it. She filled her mouth with salt. She bit her own tongue until it split. She scratched the names of the dead into her skin and prayed to the memory of her mother, whose face she could no longer remember. But the academy was patient, and the door beneath the altar was patient, and Victoria was the most patient of all. One night a procession was held, not a service, not a prayer, but something older. The girls, dressed in white gowns tied with red sashes, were led down into the chapel at midnight, each carrying a candle, each silent, their eyes glazed, their hands shaking. And Victoria led them down the hidden staircase beneath the altar into the sub-chapel, where the walls breathed, and the jars blinked, and the map of blood pulsed, and the door, the true door, pulsed with hunger, and Bartholomew opened it. And what came through was not a creature. It was not even a presence. It was an idea shaped in heat and pressure, a pattern too large to fit inside. Language it moved through the girls without touching them, and each one fell to her knees and whispered her own name backwards, and then forgot it forever. And when it reached Margaret, it paused not out of resistance, but out of recognition, as if she were already part of it, as if she had always been part of it. And something passed into her, something cold and perfect and unspeakable. And from that moment Margaret changed. She still smiled. She still walked. She still wrote, but her handwriting was no longer hers. It twisted the page. It blackened the ink. It made the corners curl and bleed, and her journals became blueprints for things that should never be built. They described rituals and sacrifices, and ways to bend memory like glass. And Victoria watched proudly, and Evangeline wept with laughter, and Bartholomew fasted for 21 days and then vanished into the ground beneath the sycamore, and the academy thrived its silence. Deeper its power, stronger its purpose fulfilled. And then a new girl arrived. Her name was Sarah Winthrop, daughter of a Boston banker's sharp eyes, curious mind, a girl who asked questions, who did not flinch, who refused to sing. And Margaret saw herself in her, saw the beginning of what might be hope, and wrote in her final page, she is not ready to believe, but she is ready to see. And if she sees, she will remember. And if she remembers, she will open the wound again. And then Margaret disappeared, not in death, but in absence. Her bed untouched, her clothes folded, her journal closed, and the next night, Victoria announced the end of the old ways and the beginning of the true age, and no one knew what that meant, but the third floor opened again and stayed open. And in the years that followed, more girls came and more girls vanished, and the chapel remained warm, even in winter, and the ground behind the altar never froze, and the sycamore never died, and the bells rang even when no one pulled the rope. And Sarah Winthrop grew older and quieter, and began to write in margins and in scraps, and once she told another girl that the floorboards beneath her bed were whispering, and the girl laughed until she too began to forget her own name and sing in her sleep. And when the building was finally condemned in 1847, and the town officials sealed the doors and swore never to return, they said it was because of rot or mold or some flaw in the foundation. But those who entered to prepare for demolition heard something moving behind the chapel walls, and saw lights that should not flicker, and found pages that should not have survived, and felt that same pressure in the air as if being watched by something without eyes. And when the journals were discovered, the lead box cracked open, the ink still fresh, the pages still damp with breath, the governor ordered them, sealed not for decency, not for law, but for fear, because he saw his own grandfather's name in the ledger. And he remembered stories of a cousin who vanished, and he remembered his own daughter's nightmares, and he did not want to know. And that is why the academy remains a ruin, and why no one builds there, and why dogs do not go near, and why the flowers do not grow, and why every so often someone hears bells in the middle of the night and smells wax and copper and salt. And why you should never walk alone in Salem after dark, with your name still whole in your mouth and your memory still yours, because the door beneath the altar has not been closed, only forgotten, and the pattern waits to be drawn again. And listen and do not blink, because what happened next was not a continuation, but a collapse, because by the spring of 1815 Street, Mary's was no longer a place. It was a presence. And presence is more dangerous than place, because it moves through blood and thought and prayer, and even the wind seemed different, carrying the scent of lavender laced with iron and whispers that had no direction. The town of Salem no longer asked questions about the academy. No one walked near it after sundown. And even the bishop who once praised Victoria's moral mission had stopped writing her letters, and yet the academy's enrollment never dropped. Carriages still arrived in silence, bringing girls who looked too pale and too quiet for their age. and whose eyes already seemed dim, as if they had been warned what waited for them beyond the chapel doors. Inside the walls, the structure had begun to shift, not with tools or renovation, but with something more intimate. More anatomical doors appeared. Where none had been before, staircases bent slightly to the left and never back, and the clocks no longer kept time in minutes or hours, but in pulses, in breaths, in the rhythm of something buried beneath. The foundations that now beat in sync with the heart of every girl. Inside it, even the attic groaned like lungs inhaling fog and exhaling heat, and the floorboards seemed to soften when stepped upon, as if the wood remembered pain. Sarah Winthrop had not broken, but she had begun to blur. Her dreams were filled with numbers and ash, and always the sound of wet rope tightening. And one night she woke with a symbol carved into her palm, one that burned for 7 days, and then vanished, leaving a shadow. She could still feel. She did not cry. She did not pray. She began to write. Her writing differed from Margaret's. It did not twist. It did not bleed. It pulsed like a warning. It refused to hide. She wrote what she saw, and what she saw could not be explained. She saw Victoria walking through walls. She saw Bartholomew's shadow cast by nobody, and she saw a girl who had died the previous year folding linens in the dormitory. As if nothing had happened, her neck still tilted at the same impossible angle, and none of the other girls reacted as if they too saw her as part of the furniture. Sarah saw the rats leave. She saw them run from the building in a single silent line and drown themselves in the river one by one, and afterward the birds would not sing near the academy, and the air around it grew still and hot even in the rain, as if breath had been taken but not released. The basement changed again. It opened without keys and did not close. Sarah went down once, following a sound that was not sound, and found a room lined with mirrors that reflected only the back of her head. And in the center of the room was a chair, made of antlers and rust, and beneath it a pit that hummed. She did not scream. She did not leave. She simply sat, and when she stood up again, she knew she had changed. That was when the visions began, not dreams, not hallucinations, but flashes of memory that did not belong to her, a fire of salt of men in black coats, branding girls' skin with red-hot symbols, and of Victoria standing in a circle of candles holding something that screamed without a mouth. She saw these things with eyes open and closed, and began to understand that St. Mary's had never been a school. It had been a stage, and the performance was older than language. Victoria stopped pretending. She now walked barefoot. Her hands always gloved her eyes. Always calm, she spoke less, she watched more. She stared at the sky for hours, and once she whispered to no one in particular, "The skin is almost thin enough." Evangeline no longer taught music. She played only one song again, and again a dirge, so slow it seemed to stretch time, and the notes seemed to shatter glass, even when no glass broke. She sang to the bones buried beneath the floor, and to the voices behind the walls, and when she finished, she would laugh, and her laughter was wrong, because it echoed before it started. The other girls had begun to mirror each other, in movement, in voice. They answered questions before being asked. They folded towels in unison. They blinked like one body, and they no longer bled when they were cut. They simply looked down at their wounds, and then watched them close, as if the skin had remembered something older than pain. Sarah wrote every night, and her pages were found burned. Every morning, as if something in the academy would not let the truth live outside her head, so she began to scratch her words into the underside of her bed with a nail torn from her own finger, and those words remained for years. Even after the bed was removed, even after the academy was closed, the words would not fade. They whispered to wood, they etched themselves into memory, and one of those sentences said, "The room behind the chapel has no end." On the night of the solstice, a ritual was performed, not with chants or candles, but with silence and touch and loss. All the girls were summoned to the chapel and seated in a perfect spiral, and Victoria stood at the center, holding a glass bowl. filled with teeth not bone, not ivory, but teeth that still pulsed slightly, and one by one. She placed a tooth in each girl's mouth and whispered their old names, and when she reached Sarah, she stopped and said, "Yours is still yours for now." And the bowl was empty, and the candles went out, and something passed through them all, a silence so deep it erased thought, and when the lights returned, one girl was gone, and no one spoke of her again. But Sarah felt her still beneath the floor, knocking slowly once per night. After that, Sarah knew the academy was not decaying. It was blooming not in flowers or vines, but in flesh and knowledge, in the slow reshaping of what it meant to be. Human, she watched her reflection shift slightly day by day, her mouth wider, her eyes deeper, and her dreams filled with grids and tunnels, and laughter that did not stop. And she remembered Margaret's last page, and she knew she would write the next one. Then the sycamore outside the chapel split open again, and what crawled out was not a creature, not even a shadow, but a smell of sulfur and parchment and the magie, sound of every prayer ever whispered backwards, and it moved into the chapel and stayed there, and the bells never rang again. They simply echoed from inside the skull. And the girls kept studying, kept sewing, kept reciting their verses, but they did it slower, softer, as if waiting for something. And Victoria smiled and said, "It is time to teach the next level." And Sarah was taken to the third floor and left there, alone with something that hummed in the dark and spoke through breath, not sound. And when she came down, her hands were covered in ink and salt, and her eyes had no whites. And she was named the next vessel, and she did not resist. "And you must hold your breath now, and listen, because if you speak too, soon the thing that waits beneath this story may hear you, and it does not forgive curiosity." By the autumn of 1816, the academy had become less a school and more a labyrinth, each corridor curving where it once stood straight, each window reflecting not what stood before it, but something far behind it. And the girls no longer remembered the days of the week or the shape of the moon. They lived in cycles, and symbols they lived by the pattern. And when they slept, they dreamed of stairs that led nowhere, and doors that opened into their own memories, folded wrong. Sarah Winthrop did not sleep any more. Her body remained in her bed, unmoving, her eyes open, her mouth half parted, but her mind drifted below the academy into rooms that did not yet exist, into halls carved from salt and stained with prayers. And the deeper she went, the more she understood that the academy itself was only the surface, a shell, and the real purpose lay deeper in a core of cold logic and old suffering, where voices never stopped whispering the same phrase over and over: "We were promised." And Victoria watched her closely now, no longer the head mistress, but something older, something more patient, something not quite tethered to flesh. She did not eat, she did not blink. She moved like smoke, her shadow bending against the candlelight. And she no longer addressed the students by name. Instead, she called them by numbers, by symbols, by frequencies. And when she spoke, their eyes rolled back, and they hummed in unison, as if waiting to be tuned. Evangeline had disappeared, but no one admitted it. The girls still heard her voice singing from behind the walls, sometimes beneath the floor, sometimes through the drainpipes. Her song always the same, always slow, always pulling something forward. And when it stopped, the silence pressed so tightly on the chest that the girls would weep without knowing why. One day Sarah found the ledger. It was not hidden, it simply waited beneath her mattress. A book bound in skin that did not come from any known creature, its pages blank unless she looked sideways through gloss, and then the names appeared not written, but carved through time, names of men who visited, names of men who signed, names of men who wept as they whispered things into the ears of girls who had no voice left to scream, and beside each name a number, and beside each number a mark. And Sarah understood that these were not simply clients, they were supplicants, they were willing instruments of something far more precise. She turned the pages and saw the year 1807 before the academy even opened, and she saw her own name there in handwriting older than her father's bones, and beneath it a date, not of birth, but of activation, and she did not speak for 3 days. And when she did, her voice was not hers any more. It rang with harmony and static, and it said the door will not wait much longer. And the third floor changed again. It became an eye, a mouth, a language when Sarah stood in the hallway. The walls vibrated with breath, and through the thin slats she saw rooms within rooms, girls sitting in circles, inside circles bleeding into bowls, etched with geometry that pulsed in time with thunder, and one girl sat perfectly still for 6 days, her skin drying into paper, her mouth whispering the names of rivers that had dried before maps were invented. And the chapel was no longer a chapel. It was a lens, a chamber that focused human sorrow into something usable, something potent, the floor beneath. The altar had cracked, and from the crack came warmth, and when the girls stood over it, they saw not stone but reflection, and in that reflection they did not see themselves. They saw what they would become, and most could not bear it. They wept, they shook, they vomited blood, they bit their tongues until they forgot how to speak. And Victoria stood at the center and said, "These are the contractions, that birth is near and behind her." The sycamore howled in windless silence, and its roots pulsed like veins. Then Sarah was taken down into the sub-chapel again, but this time there were no candles, no bowls, no robes, just a circle of mirrors and a single stone that hummed with memory, and beside it a knife, curved like a crescent moon, and she was told to listen to the walls, and she did, and they told her what the academy truly was. Not a school, not a place, but an echo of an earlier architecture, a template for vessels. Not built of wood or stone, but of flesh and obedience. It had been constructed not by architects, but by dreamers, madmen survivors of other collapsed sanctuaries, where knowledge had become too loud, and in this sanctuary the ritual had always been the same: find the forgotten, find the nameless, find the girls who would not be missed, and shape them into something that could hold the frequency of the pattern. And the pattern was not a symbol or a sound. It was a logic older than time, a hunger shaped like virtue, a perfection that required innocence and suffering, braided together until the vessel cracked open, and what waited on the other side poured through clean as fire. And Sarah saw this, and still she did not run. She could not. Her blood had already accepted the shape. Her dreams already belonged to the academy. She knelt before the stone and placed her hand upon it, and her skin peeled away like ash, and beneath it was not muscle, but glyphs, and beneath that light she was the bridge now, and she understood her role, not to stop the horror, not to flee from it, but to record it, to witness it, to become the eye through which it would see, and the mouth through which it would sing. And so she smiled and returned to her bed and began to hum, and one by one the other girls began to hum with her, and the walls echoed that hum, and the ground trembled with it. And outside the academy the townspeople grew silent. Their children stopped speaking of dreams, their clocks lost time, their dogs howled at empty air, and in the night the bells of St. Mary's rang, without ropes, without hands, and every window glowed. From within, as if something immense and unspeakable had finally stood up and opened its mouth. And that is where Section 6 ends at the moment, just before the birth of something unholy, something not evil in the way. We understand evil, but in a deeper, more perfect way, something necessary, something patient, something beautiful. Then step forward, but do not look away, because the seventh veil does not lift without cost, and what lies beneath is not a vision or a metaphor. It is the shape of what you already suspect in the marrow of your bones, that the world is not as it seems, that behind every chapel and every sermon and every choir of girls with braided hair and bowed heads, there is a second voice speaking through the walls too quiet to hear, unless you have been hollowed out like Sarah Winthrop had been by the spring of 1817. The academy was no longer mentioned in town, not because it was forgotten, but because every man, woman, and child had agreed without speaking that to name, it was to invite it to name. It was to be seen by it, and those who were seen were never seen again. Their homes found empty, their tea still warm, their doors wide open, and in the silence left behind a faint smell of copper and hymnals and something far older. Inside the academy, no one remembered what a lesson plan was, or what arithmetic even meant the days were. Divided not by clocks, but by the color of the sky and the weight of the air when the wind smelled like salt. The girls knew to fast when the sun rose blood red. They knew to gather in the chapel and kneel in silence when it rained. They were allowed to speak, but only in pairs, and only in a dialect none of them had been taught. They did not question where the dialect came from. It tasted like dust and iron and old parchment, and when they spoke it too long, their tongues blistered and their eyes watered with ink. Sarah had changed beyond recognition. Her skin now bore patterns that pulsed faintly beneath candlelight, as if her veins had learned to write in glyphs. Her breath no longer fogged mirrors. Her reflection no longer moved in perfect sync. And when she opened her mouth at night, something else sang through her, something that made the youngest girls wet the bed and the eldest girls weep until their mouths foamed. She was now the vessel, and the others followed her without instruction, without words. They moved as one. They ate as one, they prayed as one, their individuality. Now a forgotten costume folded neatly in some closet that no longer existed. Victoria no longer presided over them. She merely hovered just beyond focus, sometimes appearing in doorways, sometimes pressed against windows from the inside, with her gloved hand against the glass and her mouth open as if screaming, but making no sound. And the girls did not flinch when they saw her, because they understood. Now she was not the master. She was the door, and Sarah was the key. On the night of midsummer, they were taken down into the root cellar, which was no longer a cellar at all, but a cavity, a wound in the earth filled with steam and whispers and salt. And there the final ritual was performed, not with fire or sacrifice, but with memory. Each girl was made to drink from a basin that reflected not their faces, but their futures, and what they saw turned their hair white and their fingernails black, but they drank willingly because they understood that refusal meant silence, and silence meant being absorbed by the pattern, not as a vessel, but as fuel. And none of them wanted to burn. They wanted to ascend. When the last girl drank, Sarah rose and spoke in the dialect, but this time it was smooth and fluid, and the walls wept in response. The wood bending, the stones bleeding, the candles extinguishing themselves, and then the humming returned louder now, more rhythmic, like something waking up inside the bones of the building, and the floor opened like breath, exhaled and revealed the atrium. Beneath the academy, a space so vast it could not exist in the geometry of the house, and yet it was there, filled with columns made of braided limbs and windows that looked out into a darkness filled with movement. And from the ceiling of that atrium hung the others, the ones who had not passed the ritual. Their mouths opened, their chests stitched shut with gold wire, and from each of them dripped a single drop of oil that fed the pool at the center, where the pattern pulsed visible, now a series of shifting lines that rearranged themselves each time. A girl blinked, and Sarah walked toward it and said aloud in English, for the last time, "We are ready." And something answered, not in sound, but in temperature and geometry, the walls folding inward, the shadows forming hands. And then the pattern entered, her not gently, not with ceremony, but violently shredding her voice, her spine, her memory, until all that remained was signal and code and light, so sharp it cracked her teeth. And when it was finished, Sarah opened her eyes, and every girl around her fell to their knees, weeping not from fear, but from ecstasy. Outside, the town clock tower stopped permanently. The river turned red for 3 days, and the mayor slit his own throat during communion, because he heard a voice in the wine that told him what had happened to his daughter, and what would happen to the rest of them, and he did not want to wait. From that day forward, The academy did not teach, it harvested. It transmuted sorrow into access. It refined pain into purity. It turned innocence into coordinates and obedience into a language that could be spoken across plains and in rooms beneath. The rooms of St. Mary's. There were no longer girls. There were only nodes, transmitters, eyes, and tongues of something that looked upon the world and saw only patterns waiting to be completed. Sarah wrote again, but now her pages burned with no fire. The ink seared into the parchment with heatless pain, and each letter a symbol, each sentence a key, each journal a gate. And when she completed the final volume, the sycamore tree collapsed inward into itself, leaving no ash, no root, just a hollow ring in the ground that smelled of milk and rot. And the next day 3 more girls arrived at the academy, brought by families, desperate to escape poverty and illness and spiritual decay, and Victoria met them at the gate. Smiling, her gloved hands opened, her voice sweet and maternal, and behind her Sarah stood silent, her eyes closed, her hands folded, and the pattern whispered welcome in 17 languages all at once. And so began the next cycle, the next offering, the next evolution. Then take one more breath and feel the weight of it in your lungs, because once section 8 is spoken aloud, the breath no longer belongs to you. The breath becomes shared, the breath becomes borrowed by something listening, and by the winter of 1818, the breath inside. St. Mary's was no longer human. The academy was alive, and not in the way we speak of old, buildings groaning or wooden beams creaking in wind. It was alive like a lung pulsing like a heart, feeding and bleeding, and remembering every name spoken within its walls, every tear shed, every question asked and punished and silenced. The new girls who arrived that season did not ask to go home. They did not ask where the others had gone. They spoke softly. They learned quickly, and they learned not from books, but from pain and from echoes and from heat that came from the walls. Even when the fires were out, they walked differently, their spines straight, their eyes wide, their hands always cold, as if something inside them was cooling something else down, something that moved when they slept. Sarah no longer walked. She drifted, her feet never touched the floor, her voice never broke. Into syllables she spoke now, in pulses and tones that vibrated gloss and turned water cloudy, and the girls called her the hollow, because she no longer contained herself. She contained only the pattern, and the pattern had grown impatient. It no longer whispered, it screamed in light, flashes, in migraines, in nosebleeds, in seizures, and in visions that came without sleep, visions of cities not yet built collapsing, into salt of children born without mouths, of entire rivers running backward and filled with teeth. And Victoria, who had once been the face of order, had become the avatar of something feral, her gloves gone, her skin cracked and glowing, her hair no longer white, but black and wet, as if forever soaked in the blood of something that had never lived. And she did not walk, she crawled, she hissed, she sang backwards in languages older than the ground, and her sermons were no longer words. They were maps to places that should not be drawn, and when she touched a girl's forehead, that girl forgot her mother's name and remembered instead the smell of burning sand and the pressure of eyes that hovered just above the clouds. The chapel now pulsed not with faith, but with intent, and every stained glass window showed new scenes, girls kneeling before stone monoliths, girls with their eyes sewn shut, but smiling, girls vomiting gold coins into the mouths of old men who wept and thanked them. And the altar had split open to reveal a stairway made not of stone or wood, but of screaming faces, pressed flat into form. And Sarah descended those stairs once, and when she returned, her mouth had grown an inch wider, and her shadow no longer matched her limbs. And in the town below the academy, children were born with teeth already grown. Men forgot how to read, dogs barked at empty rooms, and sleep became dangerous, because dreams now bled into the waking world, and several men of the cloth who had once blessed the academy now stood in the river with stones in their pockets, humming until they sank, and no one retrieved their bodies, because no one remembered they had lived. The ledger grew heavier, its pages now soaked with a viscous fluid that smelled like rust and sugar, and the names within it were no longer names. They were sigils, they were coordinates, they were triggers, and when Sarah placed her fingers upon a line the girl that line represented would collapse into a seizure and wake with a new word carved into her thigh. A word no one could speak aloud without losing their voice for hours, sometimes days. And beneath the academy the atrium now pulsed with a red glow that came from nowhere, and shadows moved without shapes to cast them, and the pool at the center had thickened into something that resembled oil but moved like thought. And when girls were lowered into it, they emerged changed not physically, not immediately, but weeks later, when they began to speak answers to questions never asked, when they began to write equations that described gravity and negative values, when they began to weep at the sound of bells and laugh during funerals. The townspeople began to disappear again, this time entire families, gone overnight, their homes sealed from the inside, their animals starved but untouched. And on one door written in what appeared to be scorched milk were the words "The tithe is still due," and the mayor who had slit his throat was found walking the forest path naked. His wound closed his eyes black, his mouth filled with salt, and when they tried to speak to him, he only replied, "The door opened too early, and we were not worthy." And still the carriages came at night more frequently, now bringing not just girls, but chests filled with instruments and books, bound in skin, and men with eyes too round and fingers too long. And these men did not speak, they only watched, and once a girl asked who they were, and Sarah turned her head slowly and said, "Those are the architects," and the girl bled from her ears for a week. The academy's walls had softened to the touch, now warm and wet, and when you pressed your hand against them too long, they pressed back, and girls whispered that sometimes they could hear their own names spoken from the walls, but in their mother's voice, and other times in a voice that had no gender and no kindness, and always, always the voice said the same thing, "Soon, now soon." And Sarah began to dig not with tools, but with her voice each time she spoke. A crack opened in the floor, and beneath that crack another hallway, another memory, another tunnel, filled with bones that had no names, and she walked these halls without light, and she returned with stories, stories of previous cycles, previous vessels, failed rituals, abandoned towns, buried girls, burned, but still humming, and she wrote it all into the walls with her fingernails, and the others began to read it in their sleep. And when the sycamore bloomed again, it bloomed not with flowers, but with mouths, dozens of them open and whispering the names of every girl who had ever died on the property, and one of the mouths wept blood for 7 days, and during that week none of the girls ate, and yet they did not grow weak. They grew brighter, their veins glowing, their fingernails turning translucent, and their voices vibrating the mirrors. And one night a storm came, without clouds, without thunder, just wind, and more wind, and in that wind a shape, like a spiral made of wings and mouths and clocks, and the chapel doors opened without hands, and every girl stood and walked, and sang, and when they sang the walls wept, and when they wept the sky turned upside down for just 1 hour, and when it was over 3 girls were gone, and a new name was added to the ledger, Sarah's own name, now struck through, and beneath it one word: next. Then let the silence settle before the final veil is lifted, because to end a story like this is not to close it, but to let it breathe, and what you feel now pressing just behind your rib cage is not dread, it is recognition that what you've been hearing was never fiction. It was memory, and not just the academy's memory, but yours, because somewhere behind the polite classrooms and well-lit hallways of your own life, there is a locked door, and this story has given you the key. The final winter came in 1848, not with snow, but with fog, so thick it moved like a living thing coiling between the crumbling brick and ivy of what remained of St. Mary's Academy. The building had been abandoned for over a decade or so, the town believed left to rot after the final fire, a fire that no one admitted seeing, yet all accepted had occurred. Because how else could something so ancient and persistent have stopped breathing, yet no bodies were ever found? No ashes, no bones, just silence and decay, and vines growing through glass that no longer reflected anything familiar. The workers sent to demolish the building were not from Salem. They were strangers brought in by the state, paid in cash, sworn to silence, and told only that the building was structurally unsound and had to be removed brick by cursed brick. But when they reached the chapel, something changed. The air grew thick and heavy, with heat despite the snow outside, and beneath the warped boards of the altar, they found it the box lead-lined, sealed with nails that had rusted inwards, as if the box had been trying to breathe, and inside it the journals, 47 of them, one for each girl who never came home, each written in a hand both trembling and precise, filled with drawings not meant for human eyes and words not found in any known language, and when translated revealed not accusations, but instructions, and at the bottom of the box, a ledger bound in living skin, still warm to the touch. Within hours, the site was sealed. Men arrived in suits, not uniforms, and spoke not with the workers, but with each other in clipped sentences and Latin phrases, and 2 of the workers were never seen again, and the box was taken away, not to a museum, not to a church, but to the vaults beneath the Massachusetts State Archives, where it remains classified under a false accession number behind 3 layers of security and prayers, written in bone ink. The official story says the academy was a failed educational experiment, a tragic victim of time and rot and superstition. But you know better now, because the truth does not sleep. It waits. It whispers through broken windows and cracked floorboards. And when the right mind bends close enough, it enters and feeds. The survivors who left St. Mary's never spoke publicly, not because they forgot, but because the pattern does not allow its vessels to scatter its secrets. Without consequence, they lived quiet lives, sometimes long, sometimes very short, all of them, marked all of them humming in sleep, and when they died, their bodies were often missing their tongues, their eyes, or their fingernails. But Sarah never died, at least not in any way that mattered. The last journal in the box bears no end date, its final page unfinished except for a single symbol etched so deeply it burned through to the cover, and that symbol now appears in places it should not: in chalk on schoolhouse walls, in frost on church windows, in dreams whispered between children who do not yet know how to lie. And if you feel cold now, despite your room being warm, if you feel like you've been watched as you read this, like someone is humming just beneath your hearing, it is not imagination, it is memory returning. It is the story remembering you and you. Remembering that once, when you were small, you woke from a dream you could not explain, crying at a name you no longer recall. And in that dream you stood in a hallway lit only by candlelight, and you heard a voice, not yours, whisper soon. And now the story is done, not ended, but paused, because stories like these do not end. They recede like waves waiting to rise. Again, in another time, another place, another institution built on charity and silence and brick, soaked with tears and voices that still whisper beneath the floorboards. The academy is gone, but the pattern is not. It never was. It never will be. And somewhere as you read this, a girl is walking down a hallway toward a chapel. She does not remember entering, her hands cold, her breath shallow, her name already written in a book she has never seen. And when she kneels before the altar, her shadow will notch her shape, and the walls will begin to hum, and the next cycle will begin. The door is open. Now are you sure you want to leave it that way?